Can you possibly imagine that the woman who would one day command the global stage with an unshakable moral authority, serving as the conscience of a nation in its darkest hours and the visionary architect of universal human rights, began her life not as a chosen leader, but as a trembling, solitary child terrified of her own shadow and convinced of her own tragic inadequacy in a world that demanded perfection? The narrative arc of Anna Eleanor Roosevelt is not merely a conventional story of American privilege or aristocratic ease, but a triumph over a profound, crushing emotional starvation that would have utterly broken a lesser spirit born into the illustrious clan synonymous with American power and the rugged, boisterous vitality of her uncle Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. She was not embraced as a princess of the blood, but was instead famously and cruelly mocked as the ugly duckling by her own mother, the breathtakingly beautiful but emotionally frigid Anna Hall Roosevelt. Anna Hall, a woman who prized social grace and physical perfection above all else in the superficial world of New York high society, looked at her solemn, plain-faced daughter with a disappointment she barely bothered to conceal, often calling her Granny in front of guests, due to the child's serious demeanor and old-fashioned ways, a nickname that cut deep into Eleanor's tender psyche and left scars of inadequacy that would last a lifetime. This early rejection planted deep, gnarled roots of insecurity in Eleanor's soul, compounding a sense of unworthiness that was only exacerbated when tragedy struck with relentless surgical precision. Claiming both her parents by the time she was 10, her mother to the ravages of diphtheria and her adored, charming, but hopelessly alcoholic father, Elliot, to a seizure following a fall and a lifetime of battling his own demons, left to retreat into a virtually impenetrable shell of solitude within the relentlessly gloomy, disciplined, and joyless household of her grandmother. Hall in Tivoli, New York, she lived in a world of shadows, raised in an atmosphere where joy was suspect, silence was golden, and duty was paramount, finding solace only in the dusty pages of her books and her vivid imagination where she could be the heroine of her own life. In those long, lonely years, draped in the heavy, scratching morning clothes of the Victorian era, surrounded by the ticking of grandfather clocks that seemed to count down the empty hours, she seemed destined for a life of quiet spinsterhood, a background figure in the high society balls she dreaded, completely unaware that the iron will slowly, painfully forging within her solitary, grieving heart was preparing her not for a life of obscurity, but for a magnificent destiny that would require her to overcome personal tragedy to become the strongest, most consequential woman of the 20th century, rising from the cold ashes of her childhood to cast a warm, enduring shadow that would eventually cover the globe. The fairy tale narrative propagated by the glossy society pages of the Gilded Age suggests that marrying a handsome prince guarantees a happy ending. But for Eleanor, her union with her dashing fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, proved to be less of a liberation and more of a transfer from one gilded cage to another, more ornate and suffocating prison, entering what seemed to the outside world as a perfect alliance of two patrician families on St. Patrick's Day in 1905, with President Theodore Roosevelt giving the bride away and stealing the spotlight with his boisterous presence and booming laughter. Eleanor found herself almost immediately suffocating behind the heavy, impenetrable high society veil. She struggled desperately to fit the rigid mold of a submissive Victorian wife, a role for which she felt entirely ill-equipped, having no natural talent for the frivolous banter of cocktail parties, the intricate management of a grand household staff, or the social maneuvering required of a political wife in New York's elite circles. Far worse than the domestic duties was the looming, oppressive presence of her formidable mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, a woman of imperious nature and velvet-covered steel, who viewed Franklin not just as a son, but as her personal possession. A lifelong project she would not relinquish to a shy, awkward young woman whom she considered barely adequate for the task. Sarah dictated every aspect of their domestic life with a terrifying benevolence, famously buying them a townhouse in New York City that was physically connected to her own with sliding doors that allowed her to enter their lives at will, choosing their furniture, hiring their servants, and even undermining Eleanor's authority over her own children, famously telling the grandchildren, "Your mother only bore you. I am the one who loves you." For years, Eleanor felt like an intruder in her own marriage, a guest in her own home, constantly overshadowed and dominated by the matriarch, reinforcing her childhood belief that she was incapable of commanding respect or affection on her own merits, leading her to bury her own desires deep beneath layers of duty and obedience, losing herself in the process of becoming Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt's, a role that fit her like an ill-tailored suit that she could not take off no matter how much it chafed against her spirit. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. The fragile ecosystem of her life, held together by sheer willpower, duty, and denial, was shattered in the autumn of 1918, leading to a pivotal, heart-stopping question that would redefine her existence. What happens when the only love you have ever known, the one anchor you have in a turbulent world, turns out to be a devastating lie? While unpacking Franklin's suitcase after he returned from a trip to Europe suffering from double pneumonia, Eleanor discovered a small bundle of love letters bound together with a ribbon. Letters that revealed a truth so painful it threatened to stop her heart. Her husband was engaged in an intense romantic affair with her own social secretary, the young, charismatic, and beautiful Lucy Mercer. It was a betrayal of truly Shakespearean magnitude, cutting deeper because it came from the two people she had trusted most, the husband she adored with a naive devotion, and the assistant she had treated like family, welcoming her into their home and their lives with open arms. As she read the words of passion that Franklin had never written to her, the romantic bond she had clung to died instantly, replaced by a cold, profound grief that could have destroyed a weaker spirit. She felt the ground beneath her dissolve, realizing that her perfect marriage was a sham and that she had been living a lie for years. Yet this moment of total destruction was also the catalyst for her greatest reconstruction. Confronting Franklin with the evidence in a moment of rare, cold fury, she offered him a divorce, a scandalous proposition for the time that would have ruined them both socially and politically. However, when his mother threatened to cut him off financially and his political advisor, Louise Howe, warned that divorce would end his career, Franklin begged for a second chance. Eleanor agreed, but on her terms, no more Lucy Mercer, and they would live as partners, not lovers, sleeping in separate bedrooms and living separate emotional lives. In that crucible of pain, the submissive wife died, and a woman of steel began to emerge, realizing that if she could survive this, she could survive anything, marking the birth of her true self. Forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the icy realization that she must be the architect of her own happiness. In the aftermath of the affair, a fascinating and historically significant transformation occurred, raising the question, could a broken marriage actually become the engine of one of the most powerful political dynasties in history? Refusing to dissolve the union in order to salvage Franklin's rising career and preserve the family name, Eleanor leveraged this new, pragmatic arrangement to negotiate a profound independence for herself, stepping out of the domestic shadow that had nearly consumed her to find her voice in the gritty, smoke-filled world of political activism. Encouraged by Louis Howe, the chain-smoking, disheveled political strategist who saw her potential when no one else did, she joined organizations like the League of Women Voters and the Women's Trade Union League, learning to organize, to debate, and to lead among reformers who cared nothing for her pedigree and everything for her commitment. It was here, among suffragettes, labor activists, and social workers, women who were fighting for the very soul of America, that she discovered a latent talent for organization and public speaking, though she initially struggled with a high-pitched voice that rose uncontrollably when she was nervous. She practiced relentlessly, forcing herself to overcome her shyness. And soon, her ability to connect with an audience rivaled and eventually complemented her husband's strategic mind. She realized that while their romantic marriage was over, their professional alliance was just beginning. And she became his eyes and ears in places he could not go, proving that a partnership based on shared goals and mutual respect could be more formidable than one based on romance alone, fundamentally reshaping the American political landscape and creating a new model for the modern political couple that was less about domestic bliss and more about shared power. A duality that would eventually conquer the White House and change the world. The true test of this partnership arrived with brutal suddenness in the summer of 1921, forcing the world to ask, when the golden boy could no longer walk, who would stand tall in his place and carry the torch of his ambition? When polio struck Franklin down at their vacation home on Campobello Island, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down, writhing in pain and fever, his political future seemed to evaporate overnight. The vigorous man of action was reduced to a helpless invalid, dependent on others for his most basic needs, unable to even stand without excruciating effort. In this dark hour, the battle lines were drawn between resignation and resilience. His mother, Sarah, urged him to retire to the family estate at Hyde Park, to live out his days as a genteel invalid hidden away from the pitying eyes of the public, protected like a porcelain doll in a glass case. Eleanor, however, fought fiercely and relentlessly against this sentence of living death, aligned with Louis Howe. She argued that Franklin needed a purpose to survive, that giving up on politics would mean giving up on life itself. She became the guardian of his ambition when he had none left, nursing him through the darkest nights of his depression while simultaneously keeping his name alive in the Democratic Party by appearing everywhere he could not. She became his legs, traveling to inspect institutions, speaking at rallies, and attending meetings he physically could not reach, reporting back to him with detailed observations that kept his mind sharp and his spirit engaged. This period transformed her from a supportive spouse into a critical political surrogate, a seasoned operative without whom his return to power and his eventual governorship of New York would have been utterly impossible, forging a bond of dependency that was as political as it was personal, cementing her place as his indispensable partner in a crusade against fate itself. Amidst this whirlwind of duty, public service, and the constant management of a disabled husband, one might wonder, is it possible to find true freedom in a humble cottage when you are accustomed to living in a palace? Seeking an escape from the suffocating atmosphere of the main Roosevelt estate where Sarah still ruled with an iron fist, Eleanor established her own sanctuary at Valkill, a modest stone cottage built on the Hyde Park grounds but worlds away in spirit. It was here, by the quiet stream, amidst a circle of powerful female friends like Marian Dickerman and Nancy Cook, and political allies who respected her intellect, that she manufactured the furniture of her own life, literally and figuratively. She co-founded Valkill Industries, a furniture factory dedicated to reviving rural craftsmanship to provide jobs for local farmers, but more importantly, she created a space where she was the undisputed matriarch, where she paid the bills, drove her own car, and cooked her own meals, however poorly as her famous scrambled eggs attested. Valkill cemented her status as a power player independent of FDR. It was the place where she hosted political strategists, social reformers, and labor leaders, creating a kitchen cabinet of her own where ideas were debated freely and policies were born. This cottage gave her the emotional and physical space to develop the progressive ideologies and strategies that would later define her tenure as First Lady, proving that she was no longer just Mrs. Roosevelt, but a formidable force in her own right, with her own home and her own destiny, separate from the suffocating expectations of the Roosevelt dynasty, a place where she could finally breathe the air of freedom and speak with her own voice. When Franklin won the presidency in 1932, amidst the wreckage of the Great Depression, a new anxiety emerged. Why would a woman who had spent years terrified of public scrutiny and fighting for her own identity dread the role of First Lady more than anything else? While the country cheered for a new era and the promise of a New Deal, Eleanor fell into a deep private depression upon his victory. Fearing that the White House would be a gilded prison of tea parties, ceremonial silence, and floral arrangements that would strip her of the independence she had fought so hard to gain. She looked at the history of First Ladies and saw a parade of silent, supportive shadows, women who were seen but not heard. And she was terrified of becoming one of them, losing her voice in the cavernous halls of power. Yet, rather than submit to the traditional constraints of the role, she decided to shatter the ceremonial mold entirely if she had to be. First Lady, she would redefine the job on her own terms to suit her relentless energy and her passion for justice. She began holding press conferences exclusively for female reporters, a masterstroke that forced news organizations to hire women if they wanted access to the White House, thereby creating jobs during the Depression and giving women a voice in the media. She refused to be silenced, turning the position into a working job that demanded accountability, action, and direct engagement with the American people. Writing a daily newspaper column, My Day, and becoming a ubiquitous presence in American life, forever changing the expectations of the president's spouse from a hostess to a humanitarian, proving that the East Wing could be just as powerful as the West Wing. The Great Depression presented a crisis of unprecedented scale, posing the question: can one woman's empathy actually alter the course of a nation in deep despair? Refusing to stay cloistered in the comfort of Washington, Eleanor traveled relentlessly, logging thousands of miles to go where the suffering was most acute, deep into the damp, dangerous coal mines of West Virginia to see the black lung disease, and out to the poverty-stricken dust bowls of the Midwest where families had lost everything and hope was a distant memory. She witnessed the suffering of the American people firsthand, not through reports or statistics, but by looking into the hollow eyes of hungry children and the despairing faces of unemployed fathers descending into the dark shafts of the mines to understand the workers' plight. She returned to the White House not just with data, but with the dirt of the mines on her shoes and the stories of the forgotten in her heart, relentlessly lobbying her husband for legislation to help the poor minorities and the unemployed. She became the administration's moral compass, the agitator who constantly pushed Franklin to the left, reminding him of the human cost of every policy decision and refusing to let him ignore the uncomfortable truths of American poverty. She championed experimental communities like Arthurdale for displaced miners, and though not all her projects succeeded, her visible presence gave the nation hope that someone in the highest corridors of power truly saw them serving as the voice for the voiceless, when political expediency threatened to ignore the most vulnerable, acting as the bridge between the government and the governed. Her commitment to justice was inevitably put to the test on the racial divide, leading to a defining moment in American history. What happens when a First Lady publicly defies the establishment to demand racial justice in a segregated nation? In 1939, a bold defiance of segregation shocked the conservative establishment when the Daughters of the American Revolution, an organization of elite lineage to which Eleanor herself belonged, refused to let the renowned African-American contralto Marian Anderson perform at Constitution Hall solely because of her race. Eleanor did not merely send a letter of protest, she resigned her membership publicly, stating in her column that she could not belong to an organization that violated the fundamental American principles of equality, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington society. But she did not stop at resignation. She worked behind the scenes with the NAACP and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes to arrange for the concert to be held on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a symbolic venue of immense power, on Easter Sunday, attended by 75,000 people and broadcast to millions more. Marian Anderson sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee," and Eleanor Roosevelt's silent presence behind that event spoke louder than any speech she could have given. She had publicly aligned herself and the White House with the civil rights movement decades before it became mainstream political discourse, enduring vicious attacks from Southern segregationists and risking her husband's political coalition, proving she was willing to spend her political capital to fight for the dignity of all Americans. making a statement that would echo through the generations as a prelude to the civil rights battles to come. As the shadow of global conflict lengthened and the United States entered World War II, a new paradox arose. Why was the woman who dedicated herself to comforting wounded soldiers labeled a danger to national security by her own government's agencies? As the war erupted, Eleanor became a polarizing figure. Fiercely loved by the downtrodden for her compassion but hated by conservatives, and monitored by the FBI for her progressive views and insistence on civil liberties. Undeterred by the criticism or the physical danger, she undertook grueling trips to the theaters of war, traveling to the South Pacific under the codename Rover, visiting wounded troops near the front lines in islands still smoldering from battle. She slept in rough barracks, ate mess hall food, and walked miles through field hospitals to offer comfort to dying men, stopping at every bed to look them in the eye and hold their hands, smelling the overwhelming nausea-inducing scent of stale, antiseptic drying blood and palpable fear, yet bringing a mother's touch to the doomed. She would take down names and addresses to write to their families back home, a promise she always kept, writing thousands of letters personally, boosting morale in a way that military leadership could not. To the soldiers, she was a surrogate mother in a hellish landscape. Yet, back home, she faced harsh criticism for her perceived meddling in military affairs and her insistence on discussing civil rights even during wartime, with critics shouting Eleanor everywhere. But she pressed on, illustrating the immense personal cost of being a disruptor in a time of enforced unity, believing that the war was being fought not just for territory, but for the very values of freedom and equality she championed, arguing that democracy must be lived to be worth dying for. While she ministered to the world, a tragic dynamic played out in private. How can two people leading the free world drift so far apart within the walls of their own home? The distance between Eleanor and Franklin, which had begun with the affair decades earlier, grew into a vast, silent chasm during the war years, exacerbated by the crushing pressure of the conflict and their deteriorating health. Franklin was consumed by the strategic demands of global conflict, his health failing under the strain, seeking solace in the company of people who would not challenge him, who would let him relax and laugh over a cocktail. Eleanor, driven by her Griselda conscience and her terrifying awareness of the world's suffering, could not stop pressing him on domestic reforms, refugees, and post-war planning, unable to switch off her crusade even for dinner. They lived parallel lives in the White House, often communicating via memos and scheduled appointments rather than intimate conversation, as Eleanor pushed tirelessly for a better world while Franklin's health rapidly deteriorated in a silence he refused to share with her. She saw the gray pallor of his skin and the shaking of his hands, but the walls they had built to survive their marriage now kept them from comforting each other in the end, leaving them as powerful partners who were essentially strangers to each other's inner hearts, united in purpose but divided in spirit. A tragedy of two great souls unable to find peace in each other. The final blow to this complex historic partnership came in April 1945, forcing the heartbreaking question, can a heart break twice over the same old secret? Franklin D. Roosevelt died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia, while Eleanor was in Washington. And amidst the shock of the national mourning as she traveled to bring his body home, Eleanor was dealt a final crushing personal blow. She learned that Lucy Mercer, now Rutherford, had been with him when he passed away, revealing that the affair she thought had ended decades ago had merely gone underground. It revealed that her husband had reconnected with his former lover, that she had been visiting him at the White House with the collusion of their daughter Anna, and that he had died in her presence, enjoying the comfort she provided. Eleanor was forced to bury her husband and the painful, resurrected secrets of their marriage simultaneously, maintaining a stoic, dignified face for a grieving nation, standing like a statue at the funeral while internally processing a betrayal that underscored the profound loneliness of her position. It was a cruel irony. The woman who was the mother of the world, who had comforted thousands of soldiers and citizens, was ultimately excluded from the most intimate moment of her husband's life, left to mourn alone in the spotlight, holding the weight of a nation's grief while her own heart remained privately shattered, a final sacrifice on the altar of public service. With the president gone, the world expected the widow to fade away into the history books. But does a story truly end when the main character leaves? Or is that simply the prologue for a new, even greater chapter? Expected to retire quietly to Hyde Park, to knit by the fire and live out her days in memory of her husband, Eleanor rejected a life of leisure and silence, famously telling a reporter the story is over, but she was wrong. It was only just beginning. When President Harry Truman, recognizing her immense influence and unique capability, asked her to join the first U.S. delegation to the United Nations, she initially hesitated, feeling unqualified without her husband's guidance, but then accepted, realizing there was still work to be done and that she had a voice of her own. She stepped onto the global stage, not as a wife, not as a surrogate, but as a diplomat and stateswoman in her own right. She walked into the male-dominated assembly of the UN in London, where many doubted a woman could handle the intricacies of international diplomacy or stand up to the tough Soviet negotiators. She proved them wrong immediately, debating with clarity and force, winning over her detractors with her preparation and her obvious moral clarity, and preparing to shape the future of the post-war world with a vision of peace that was distinctively her own. Transitioning from the First Lady of the United States to a global figure of moral authority who would outshine even the presidency itself. It was at the United Nations that she faced her greatest challenge and achieved her most enduring triumph. How do you convince a fractured ideological world to agree on the very definition of human dignity? Appointed as the chair of the Commission on Human Rights, Eleanor faced down Soviet hardliners, skeptical male diplomats who thought the task impossible, and the intense pressures of the emerging Cold War, undertaking a task that many deemed futile. For 2 years, she presided over endless meetings, often lasting late into the night, using her famous patience, her diplomatic skill, and an iron will wrapped in gracious manners to keep the committee at the table when tempers flared and negotiations stalled. She navigated the cultural, religious, and political tensions to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, fighting for every word to ensure it protected the rights of all people everywhere, regardless of race, creed, or gender. When the General Assembly adopted the Declaration in 1948 with a standing ovation, it was her greatest personal achievement, a testament to her unwavering belief in the worth of every individual. She had succeeded where seasoned diplomats had failed, forever enshrining the right she had fought for all her life into international law, and proving once and for all that her power came not from her marriage to a president, but from her own intellect, humanity, and relentless Dr. creating a legacy that would protect generations yet unborn and serve as a beacon for freedom in a divided world.